It was a night just like this. 6 campers were out with their scoutmaster on an overnight camping trip. They were just settling in after a long day of hiking when suddenly they heard it. A wailing coming from the forest that chilled them to the bone. They had all heard of the Woods Witch. Everyone around here had heard of the Woods Witch. They all knew how she lured all those children into the forest so long ago. They all knew about the search party that had heard screams echoing through the woods that night as they searched in vain for their lost kids. And, of course, they all knew about how they found Chimney Cave, full of bones and half-eaten bodies of the missing children she'd taken. They also knew how the townspeople buried her alive after setting fire to her den inside that cursed cave. They didn't believe the legends about the Woods Witch, how she still haunted the woods and killed anyone foolish enough to stay there after dark. They unwisely went to sleep, huddled down in their sleeping bags, and tried to ignore the eerie moaning that came echoing from the woods. Then they heard it. Deep in the night, the wailing getting closer and closer to their campsite. The scouts couldn't sleep. They huddled in their sleeping bags as the wailing grew closer and closer. They heard the trees shake and the leaves crackle as the wailing came closer and closer. They added their fearful cries to the wailing as it grew closer and closer until finally, boo! We all jumped, but none of us jumped higher than Reggie. Bobby, grinning like an idiot as he stood at the edge of the firelight, pointed and laughed at the wet spot on the front of Reggie's shorts. His cretinous little friends joined in, but I just sighed and shook my head. Every day with this bunch, I swear. Look, guys, Wedgie had a little accident. Bobby cawed laughter as his other 2 meathead friends laughed along with him. Mark and Kyle weren't much higher in the brains department than Bobby, but they knew enough to laugh when he laughed. Otherwise, they might find themselves at the end of a beating. I looked at Reggie and sighed. How did a kid like Reggie get roped into the Boy Scouts? I had been with the Scouts for about 3 years now, and I think if my dad hadn't been so serious about me staying, I would have left after the first week. I know it doesn't seem like much, kiddo, but if you just climb the ranks, maybe even stay until middle school, it'll look good on a college transcript one day. You gotta think about those extracurriculars while you're young, he said with all the weight of a man handing down a cosmic truth. Yeah, thanks, Dad. After 3 years of being in a 4-man scout troop with Bobby Terry and his idiot friends, all I had to show for it was some knot-tying knowledge and the ability to identify poison oak. The last 3 years had also been filled with Bobby and his friends trying to tease and bully me, and me ignoring them until they stopped, only to start up again a little while later. The scoutmasters we had tried to hold our attention, but the 3 of them were more intent on making everyone else's life a living hell than learning about knots or birds or whatever. In a way, it had been a blessing when Reggie joined. Reggie was this overweight kid with glasses and a fear of everything. He had transferred into my troop about a month ago. Reggie and his mom had just moved into town, and even though he'd been in the Scouts before, he seemed pretty pathetic at most everything. The only thing he seemed to excel at, and even I felt a little bad about thinking it, was being a big fat target for Bobby and his friends. I felt sorry for him, of course, as he sat there in his chocolate-stained uniform and his discolored shorts that had been peed in one too many times. Still, it was also kind of nice to get a break from Bobby and his constant need to torment someone. Since Reggie had come along, I had been all but invisible to their kind, and I kind of liked it. Scoutmaster Mike, our designated grown-up for this trip, sighed and glared at Bobby. Bobby Terry, if you don't calm down, I'm going to call your father and tell him to come pick you up. Is that what you want? Bobby stopped laughing. Bobby's father was the only thing that seemed to take the wind out of his sails. Mr. Terry was a beefy car mechanic with no neck and big scarred hands that always made me think he beat the cars into submission before fixing them. He always showed up to get Bobby at the end of meetings in his ratty old blue Ford, wearing his faded blue jumpsuit with Terry stitched on it and a slim cigar poking out of his mouth. He always growled around that cigar to tell Bobby to get the hell in the truck, I'm missing my dinner. It had been unanimously decided, my dad once told me, that Bobby's dad didn't have to chaperone scout outings, and this seemed to be just fine with Mr. Terry. Reggie sniffed and stood up sheepishly. Mr. Mike, I think I need to change my pants. Scoutmaster Mike blew out a long, horsey breath. Go ahead, Reggie. The rest of you go get ready for bed. We have a long hike to Chimney Cave tomorrow, and I don't want to hear about anybody being tired tomorrow morning. Lights out in 20. And with that, he set about getting the campsite ready for bedtime, as we shuffled into the big 6-man tent we'd all be sharing. It wouldn't do any good to argue with Scoutmaster Mike. He wasn't an ideal scoutmaster, and arguing usually just got you a locked tent flap as he sat in his tent and ignored you. Of course, he wasn't supposed to lock his tent, but my dad told me that Mr. Mike had this weird fear of bugs crawling into his tent at night, so we always ensured his tent was secured with a lock from the inside. I flopped down onto my sleeping bag as Mark, Kyle, and Bobby arranged their bags close enough that they could see what Bobby had brought. I took out my lamp and a copy of Lord of the Rings as I settled in for a little reading before bed. Reggie came into the tent a few minutes later, wearing a pair of pajama bottoms with cartoon characters on them. He smelled slightly of urine, and when he pitched his bag towards the other end of the tent, I was silently glad. The other 3 boys were gathered around Bobby's sleeping bag, ignoring Reggie for once. Bobby had taken some of his father's dirty magazines, and now that their tired game of pick on the fat boy had ended, they were content to ogle the glossy pictures. Reggie crawled into his sleeping bag, looking for all the world like a giant green caterpillar. I went back to my book, losing myself in Tolkien's world of elves and orcs and magic rings. When it became apparent that Scoutmaster Mike wasn't going to yell at us to turn the lights off, and no one was going to opt for an early bedtime, I rolled over and went to sleep. The following day, Scoutmaster Mike didn't come out for breakfast. We banged on his tent and tried to get his attention, but he wouldn't come out. The cooler with the food was in his tent, so we started getting restless after a breakfast of granola bars, water, and trail mix. We were supposed to go on our hike to Howling Cave today, and as the morning crept closer to midday, we all began to get pissy as small children are wont to do. Finally, Bobby shouted that he had just cut the tent open and see what was taking Scoutmaster Mike so long. After he failed to find his pocket knife, though, the threat stopped being so threatening. I, for one, was pretty glad he had lost it. Nothing in these woods frightened me as much as Bobby Terry with a knife. Finally, at around 10:30, Bobby announced that we should all just pack up and go to Howling Cave ourselves. Without Mr. Mike? Reggie asked, a stutter creeping into his voice. Oh no, Wedgie, I guess you're right. We can't go without him. Gee, maybe we'll just roll his tent along behind us so he can sleep and chaperone us. Guess without him, stupid. It's not like all of us haven't been there before. This was technically true. When we were first-year scouts, we had all camped here. Scoutmaster Eddie had taken us up to Howling Cave and let us explore it a little. I remember being disappointed because none of us found out why it was called Howling Cave. At the age of 6, I thought it was because wolves lived there, and I wanted to find one so I could keep him as a pet. Bobby had also pushed Kyle off a rock shelf while horsing around, so we had to leave before exploring all the tunnels. If we went by ourselves, though... I put a few things in my pack, and as Bobby and his friends headed out, I tagged along behind them. Bobby noticed me at once. You coming too, Squints? He asked, bringing out his old nickname for the occasion. Long as you don't get lost, I guess, I said. We hadn't gone far when a loud, running, huffing figure came up to join us in our travels. Reggie had thrown on his bulging knapsack, and it looked like he was prepared for a week on the Appalachian Trail. His mother had packed half a pharmacy and 2/3 of a Sears camping department into it. He was now running after us like the devil himself was in pursuit, clanking and shaking all the while. Bobby sneered at him, but replaced the sneer with a big cheesy grin when he came blustering up to join us. "Oh, good! You made it, Wedgie. This hike just wouldn't be the same without you," he said in a saccharine sweet voice. The rest of the hike was spent with Bobby and his friends having a whispered conversation that I did not like. Despite what I'd said earlier, there was no chance of us getting lost. We may not have been in a state park or anything, but Howling Cave doubled as a trailhead for a branch of the Appalachian Trail, and there were markers all along the way. The hike was an easy one, half a mile up to the cave on fairly level terrain through the cool shadows of the woods. Bobby and his friends led the way, and Reggie and I were relegated to picking up the rear as we went along. I had expected Reggie to slow us down or start whining like he usually did, but he kept pace somehow and seemed pretty comfortable as we rolled along. Even so, there was sweat standing out on all of us by the time we got to Howling Cave. The entrance yawned like a hungry mouth, and as we stepped into the coolness of the cavern, we were plunged into near darkness in no time. Flashlights winked on, and we swept them around the big entrance cave, the ceiling hanging like a waiting predator. The beams fell on a series of tunnels. The tunnels were called the Roots, and the cave we were in was called the Trunk. Many of the trails met up and cut back to the Trunk, with only a few of them ending in dead ends. A ranger, or whoever was in charge of keeping the bears and things out of this popular tourist destination, had nailed a plaque up on the wall that showed the tunnel's various routes and intersections. We were all looking at the map when we heard the wail. It was otherworldly, like a banshee's cry, and it seemed to slice through the trunk like a knife through butter. We all looked up at the sound, and Reggie wasn't the only one who looked a little scared. We all stood perfectly still for a count of 5, before Reggie voiced what we were all thinking. What was that?" "Maybe," Bobby said, a sly grin stretching his face. "It was the woods witch who lives in this cave. She smelled your dinner rolls and got hungry, Wedgie." Bobby turned suddenly and grabbed a double handful of the boy's large and overflowing gut. Reggie screamed and tried to pull away, but Bobby had him in a firm grip and cackled madly as he pinched and pulled at the fat rolls. Reggie finally pulled away, and as he stumbled, sobbing to the stone floor, I found myself reaching to help him up. "Knock it off, Bobby," I said, already tired of this crap. "Can't you stop being a jerk for 5 seconds? Bobby oohed comically. "Look here, guys, I think Squint's found himself a boyfriend." They laughed, but I ignored them as we started down the closest trail. Anything to get away from Bobby and his little asshole brigade. I wasn't surprised when Reggie tagged along. The fat boy kept pace behind me easily, but I ignored him as we walked. I took paths at random, pretending to look at the cave formations and other natural wonders as they fell into my flashlight beam. We walked in silence for a while, the tunnels becoming slightly claustrophobic, before he thanked me for standing up for him. I guess no one had ever really stood up for Reggie before, because he seemed unsure of himself as he tripped over his hastily constructed thank you. That Bobby is a real asshole," he finished, and then covered his mouth like he'd committed blasphemy. I laughed a little. Couldn't help it. He can be. Just stand up for yourself. Maybe he'll stop. Reggie chuckled. "Maybe he'll rip my head off," he said, his voice low. We came to a fork in the path, and Reggie looked sheepishly at me. I have to pee. Will you wait for me?" he asked. I nodded, and he went down the left-hand path a ways until I couldn't see him anymore. As I stood there waiting, that stupid noise howled through the cave again, and it spiked every hair on the back of my neck. What the hell is that? I thought to myself. Far from being scared, it made me curious. Caves don't naturally scream, woods witches are not. So while I was sure the howling was how the cave had got its name, I found myself wondering how it made the noise that gave it such an ominous title. I was still wondering when suddenly and unexpectedly a tall humanoid shape lumbered from the darkness ahead and screamed at me. A beam of light lit its face, some 5 feet in the air, and I stumbled and fell backwards onto the stone floor. I scrambled back on my hands and butt and felt my palms open up as the creature walked towards me. It let out another ear-splitting howl as it towered over me, and I sat on the stone floor. All I could think to do was turn my flashlight on it and see what was going to kill me before it devoured me, my beam shaking a little as it revealed them. That's when the creature started laughing, and I realized that it was just Bobby sitting on Mark's shoulders. I got up, spitting curses as the two boys separated, flustered and thoroughly upset. I was getting ready to give them a piece of my mind when a new scream split the air. It wasn't the usual deep-throated howl of the cave, and it certainly wasn't the cry of some animal. Instead, it was a child's scream, and in it was held all the fear and hopelessness of a child's life before he comes to learn that the real monsters are the ones that walk on two legs. It was Reggie's scream, and without thinking, the three of us began to run towards it. We found Reggie sitting on the cave floor in much the same way I had been a minute ago. He was crab-walking backwards, his sneakers making little rubbery scuffing noises on the ground as he tried to climb the far wall. As I ran up, I caught a whiff of a weird smell that wafted around the small chamber, some metallic odor that became known to us when we finally came up to where Reggie was. Kyle's body hung limply from the cave wall. Someone had cut his throat for him, and then opened his stomach down to the groin and let his entrails fall out like long ropes. Someone had pushed him against the wall. The red drag marks as he'd slumped proved that, and his clothes were soaked with red, sticky blood. The three of us took a few steps away from the body, and then did what any boy our age would do, given the circumstances. We ran. The earlier trip from the camp to the cave took about 30 minutes, but I'm pretty sure we got back to the campsite in under 10. I'm still a little dazed as to how we got out of the cave so fast. As we reached the familiar tents and fire pit, though, we collapsed into huffing piles of winded flesh. Reggie began throwing up noisily into the fire pit. None of us commented on it. I felt like heaving myself, and Bobby looked like he might start throwing up or crying any minute. I guess seeing your friend gutted like a trout is a little different than drowning kittens in a sack, isn't it, Bobby? We need to tell someone, Reggie huffed as he wiped the vomit from his shiny lips. Bobby sat up and moved towards Scoutmaster Mike's tent again. He still hadn't emerged from it, and it was getting on about midday. That fact had started to scare us. Bobby pushed on the tent flap, but it was still locked from the inside. We all started pushing on the tent and yelling for Scoutmaster Mike to get up and help us, but he never even stirred inside his fortress of canvas. Bobby became angry as his shoves and screams failed to rouse the Scoutmaster, and went off to our tent to get something to cut it open with. 5 minutes later, he came out even angrier. "All right, which one of you assholes stole my knife?" he asked, his red face starting to darken as he rounded on all of us. "I bet it was you, Wedgie," he said, pushing the fat boy down so he could tower over him. "I bet you were the one that killed Kyle too, didn't you? You were the one who screamed. You were the one who found the body, and I bet you stole my knife so you could pin it all on me, didn't you?" Bobby was screaming at him now, and Reggie's sobs had a distinctly scared tone to them. I stepped between them as I had before the fight could escalate any further. "This isn't helping, Bobby. We need to get Scoutmaster Mike up so he can call the police and get some help out here." Bobby turned his attention to me, and I wasn't sure that I wanted it. "And how do you suggest we do that, huh? He's probably got his earplugs in again, so the creepy crawlies don't crawl into his brain while he's asleep. You remember last year, right? He slept through the whole jamboree because he got drunk the night before and put the plugs in." I did. Scoutmaster Mike was pretty well known for getting drunk and sleeping through his duties, but we still needed him despite his shortcomings. We tried to cut the canvas with our scout knives, but it was a slow process. While Bobby had brought his father's old buck knife, probably a piece of steel sharp enough to shave with, our scout knives were dull little things that barely fit the arts and crafts we did. Finally, after 10 minutes of hacking and digging, we worried a hole in the side of the canvas and let out an odor that smelled strangely familiar. Scoutmaster Mike was in there, all right. He'd been done the same way Kyle had. His throat cut, his entrails spilled out, his face a mask of terror and disbelief. We all flinched away from the tent in unison as the hole exposed the grisly scene within. With nowhere else to run from this awful scene, we went back to our tent and zipped the door shut. We all huddled in the corner as far from the zippered opening as we could get, and at that moment, all past feuds were forgotten, all past crimes were forgiven, and we were in that instant a united force. I'm not sure how long we sat there shivering, but it was creeping towards evening when Reggie moved towards the cooler to get something to drink. His moving seemed to break the spell over us, and suddenly we were all preparing for dinner or getting water bottles and granola bars. I pulled out my map as we ate and set it between us. Okay, so here's where we are. The road is miles from our campsite. The cave is a half a mile back that way, and there's a ranger station half a mile past it that's at the Appalachian Trail marker. Someone should go to the road and see if they can flag down a car, while someone else goes to the ranger station to see if they can get help. The others will stay here at the campsite, so we have a safe place to come back to. Whoever stays here should stoke the fire and be on the lookout for whoever's doing this. 2 kids against a murder? That sounds like a death sentence to me, said Bobby. You got a better idea? I asked, and he shook his head grudgingly and said he didn't. We should go check Mr. Mike's tent, Reggie said, his voice becoming a little less sure as we all turned to look at him. He has that old bag phone. He has the keys to the truck, so we might, I don't know, he might have something that can help us. It's not a bad idea, I conceded, decided to make my first stop, the abattoir of Scoutmaster Mike. It was becoming shadowy as we ripped the tent open and stepped in. The smell of blood was everywhere, and Scoutmaster Mike lay in his sleeping bag like an overripe pea that has burst its pod. We tried our best to ignore him as we went about taking his stuff, but it's hard to ignore a dead body that's less than 5 feet from you. Flies had gotten into our hole we had made earlier, and they were crawling along him like tiny mourners at his gaping neck and chest wound. If Scoutmaster Mike believed in hell, I could assume that this was it for him, his body flush with crawling insects, while he lay powerless to stop them. We opted to take his things out into the fresh air of the campsite. Scoutmaster Mike had an odd assortment of gear: a compass, a fire starter, a Swiss Army knife, which Bobby took, a flask of something alcoholic that was half empty, a cooler that was equal parts lunch meat, deli cheese, and beer, some rope, a faded magazine called Bazoons with a busty topless girl on the cover, his car keys, a hunting knife, and the bag phone, though, were nowhere to be found. Had the killer taken them so we couldn't call for help? Why kill Scoutmaster Mike and not kill us immediately? As we sat in the dying light of day, the howling started again. It was loud and mournful, cutting across our nerves like a knife. In our current state, it was enough to leave us shaking and unsure. It stopped after a few minutes, but a low grumble of it could be heard afterwards if you listened hard enough. As the sun went down and the howling grumbled at the edges of our hearing, I could almost believe that the woods witch, and not some murderous psycho, was responsible for all of this. Almost. I'll go to the ranger station, I said, getting up before I could think better of it. Bobby, why don't you go to the road and try to flag down a car and see if you can find someone to help us. Mark, Reggie, you guys can stay here at camp and keep the fire stoked. I should be back in 2 hours tops with help. Sound like a plan? I had expected a token argument from Bobby, but it never came up. He just nodded, slipping the knife into his pocket and going towards the road. Reggie begged to go with me, but I told him to stay here with Mark and keep watch. He didn't fight me on it, but he slumped off dejectedly to sit on a log by the fire. With a nod to Mark, I set off for the ranger station. Like I said before, the trail to the cave is clear enough for a blind man to follow, but I didn't want to get anywhere close to that cave if I could help it. I took the trail until I could see the heading for the cave and then broke off into the woods. I was trying to link up with another trail that went to the ranger station, but I must have gotten turned around because I found myself back at my original entry point after several minutes of scrambling through the woods. That's when I heard the howling again. I don't know if it was proximity to the cave or what, but for just a few seconds, I don't remember being able to hear much besides the wailing that cut through the quiet night. It drove me to my knees as its pitch became higher, and as I glanced around, it seemed like that wail was coming from the trees itself. Thunder rumbled overhead, and it lit up the night for a momentary burst in time. I found my feet as the howling ebbed a little, and realized that it wasn't the howling moving the trees, but the wind. A storm seemed to be brewing, and as I tried to find my bearings in the deepening dark, another fork of lightning split the sky. The flash was bright enough to illuminate a figure not 5 feet away from me. I added my screams to the howling as the hunched and twisted creature was once again hidden by the tangle of forest. In the ebb of the howling, I could hear it creeping noisily towards me. As the lightning pealed again, I got a brief glance of a steely blade in its hunched hands, and I trembled. It had a knife, the knife it had likely used to kill Kyle and Scoutmaster Mike. And if I didn't get out of here, it was going to kill me too. That's when I ran. Turned tail and ran, and when I hit the trail I had left behind, I kept right on running, losing myself in the woods. I have no idea how far I ran, limbs whipping my face and branches cutting my legs, but it was well and truly dark by the time I found the stream. I crashed into it like a herd of buffalo, and my feet snagged on a rock as I stepped in. I fell, tumbling over in the cold water of the shallow stream, and cut my forehead on a jagged bit of rock. I came up sputtering, hand going to my forehead to staunch the blood, and as the lightning flashed again, I saw something in the water. A neat little package was submerged in the sluggish current of the stream. It was wrapped in fabric of some kind, and I realized that it was a pair of scout shorts as I unwrapped it. They smelled awful, but the river had washed them somewhat and left them soggy. Inside the shorts, however, was the Motorola bag phone Scoutmaster Mike had brought, and the keys to his truck. Both had been drenched by the river, but the keys had been banged around and bent up. I doubt they would even fit the ignition of the truck ever again. I stared at the things for a second, puzzled as to why someone would do this, when I realized the shorts were too big to belong to anyone but Reggie. Why steal Reggie's shorts for this? That's when I heard someone screaming close to the river, and I realized how close to our campsite I was. I could see the shadowed hulk of our tents, and though the camp should have stood out like a beacon with its roaring fire, the flames had guttered, and the camp was bathed in shadow. A drop of rain hit my forehead as I stepped into camp, and a lightning flash lit up another body sitting next to the fire. In a brief spark of light, I was certain it would be Reggie, his protruding guts opened and overflowing. As I came up beside the dying fire, though, I could see that it was Mark. He'd been done like the others. I felt tears on my face as I knelt beside him. Mark was a shit like Kyle had been a shit, but they were still kids. Kids aren't supposed to die like this. Kids are supposed to languish in the idea of immortality until we realize in our teenage years just how fragile we are, which brings about adulthood. No child out on a campout should have to face the idea that his life might be bled out next to his cook fire, and Mark was certainly no exception. Mark had wanted to be a baseball player, a dream a lot of little boys have. Though I didn't know him very well, I felt like certainly he deserved better than this. When someone suddenly grabbed my hand, I felt my bladder let go as I pissed my pants. Mark's hand was slick with his blood, but he clung to life even as it leaked out of him. His breathing was jagged and watery, but he seemed determined to impart some wisdom before he died. He put his other hand on the torn opening of his throat and croaked out a single word. Bobby. Bobby? Bobby did this to you? But Mark shook his head in a small, jerking way. Bobby, gone. Reggie, cave, went. Help him. He sputtered out the last with a gout of blood as he flopped back lifeless. I sat with him until he died. Then I made my way to Howling Cave. I didn't want to go to Howling Cave. It was the last place I wanted to go. But if the murderer had Reggie or Bobby, I felt like I needed to help them. That's what you do when someone's in trouble, after all. I didn't feel like a little kid anymore. I didn't feel like I sometimes did when I pretended to be a superhero or some other things for a game. I felt like the kids in those adventure books I read. I felt like I had to do the last thing I wanted to do, and if it meant the monster was to be killed, then it was me that had to go do it. The rain fell on me in sheets as I got close to the cave's mouth. The wind picked up, and as the trees shook and danced, the howling scream cut across the forest in a high, crystalline note. I wondered as I went in if there was a woods witch waiting for me in there, some boogeyman that I could blame all of this on instead of some hardened psychopath with a taste for murder. I doubted it, but I almost hoped for a witch as I came to the mouth of the cave. Kids in stories tend to fare pretty well against witches in the end. It was pitch black inside, but I had a flashlight. My beam found an easy trail to follow almost immediately. Someone had left bloody sneaker prints on the cave floor, and I could only hope that it wasn't on purpose. I crept along through the tunnels. As I went, I began to see signs of a fire up ahead. All of a sudden, the howling raced across me again, and I covered my ears to block it out. It was louder than I'd ever heard it, an otherworldly wail that made me want to fall down and cry. I moved towards the fire, always towards the fire, and it led me to a small chamber near the very back of the cavern. A placard on the wall declared that this was the witch's hovel. I suspect that it had been set up after the legend got popular. There was a cauldron, some shelves along with some old books, a cane broom, and... Bobby! My flashlight found the back of the scout shirt as I moved closer. Someone had leaned Bobby Terry against the corner like a naughty child. There was a standing pool of red around him, and I didn't even need to flip him over to know that he was long gone. He was on his knees, face pressed against the stone. I saw my hand reaching out to turn him around, and I pulled it back before I could have another murder etched into my mind forever. I heard footsteps behind me then, and flipped around to find the last person I'd expected. Reggie? He smiled at me, and my flashlight glinted off the knife in his hand. All things considered, he was really none the worse for wear, though the bloodstains on his uniform looked fresh enough to make me think he'd gotten wounded. When the howling started again, I looked up towards the ceiling and felt stupid for ever being afraid. The placement of the hovel in the chamber was pretty smart on someone's part, because the chimney-like opening at the top of the cave made the howling sound I'd heard when the wind blew across it. The howling and the wailing had been nothing but a big bottle for the wind to blow across. The revelation distracted me from Reggie, and it almost cost me my life. I was honestly hoping you'd make it out. You're the first person in this situation that's ever been genuinely nice to me, and I appreciate that. I really do, he said before snaking forward and trying to slice me with the knife. I stepped back from him. The blade cut a long gash in the front of my uniform, but never hit the skin. I took another step back and analyzed this new Reggie. This wasn't the soft-spoken, scared little boy from the camp who pissed his pants and shrunk from bullies. This Reggie was a competent, crafty creature who waddled less and stalked more. He looked at me like an artist who's sizing up marble for his next sculpture, like a painter who's trying to winkle the next masterpiece from his canvas, a writer wheedling the next bestseller from the aether, or a predator contemplating his next meal. I thought about running, but he was blocking the only exit. I could juke around him maybe, but he'd proven himself to be very quick already. I found myself backing up, Reggie walking towards me with all the ease of a B-movie slasher. Suddenly my heels struck something on the floor, and I tripped. I cursed myself mentally as I fell, and Reggie stalked in, easy as you please, as I crab-walked backwards. Why, Reggie? Why would you do this? Reggie seemed to think about it for a minute. 'Cause I can. The knife opened up my stomach in a single slash, and as his entrails spilled out, the witch laughed and laughed, having claimed yet another victim. The police would later find the bodies of the scouts and their scoutmaster, but no sign of the weapon or the killer would ever be discovered. To this day, they say you can hear the witch's unearthly howl on quiet nights, and those who sleep within her woods may find themselves to be her next victim. The campers sat around the fire with big moony eyes as I finished the story, and they all glanced around as the fire crackled, trying to get a glimpse of the woods witch before she got them. The woods suddenly caught a pine knot, and the loud crack made all of them jump before laughing at their own jitters. The 7 scouts, none of them older than I had been when I first stepped into the woods, discussed the story in low whispers amongst themselves. A pudgy, freckled-faced scout with the unfortunate name of Davy spoke up just as I thought they were all about to settle in for the night and drift to their tents. "Scoutmaster Lawson, is there really a woods witch?" One of them, a tow-headed kid named Ken, who reminded me a little of Bobby Terry, guffawed loudly and made a rude noise. "Little Davy's scared of the woods witch. It's just a story, Nimrod." Actually, my own scoutmaster told us about the woods witch when I camped in the woods. It's a local legend that's supposed to have some historical fact. Though I doubt she still lives anywhere around here, I said. Davy looked a little relieved as he put another marshmallow on his stick and held it out over the fire. "Thanks, Scoutmaster Lawson." "Call me Reggie," I said, smiling. "All my friends used to." Good evening, everyone. It's me, Dr. Plague. Thank you so much for joining me tonight. I hope you guys enjoyed the Campfire Stories compilation. It's been a long time coming, but I figured I'd go back and put some of my 2-parters or 3-parters or as many as 8-parters into a little series so that you could watch them all at once instead of having to look for individual parts. Time to thank our patrons. Thanks to Leslie Lou Riddle for being our Spooky Skeleton tier contributor. Thanks, Leslie. We just couldn't do it without you. If you too would like to support the show, come on down to Patreon. For just $5 a month, you too can be part of our Spooky Skeleton army and have your name read out at the end of every video and every TikTok that I make. If you'd like to read tonight's story yourself, you can always buy a copy on Amazon. It's Internet Nightmares, my first compilation, which is 13 stories to terrify. And as always, thanks for stopping by. Dr. Plague, signing off. Have a wonderful evening.